I don't know whether Tim copied it or not.
So it's not copied to the computer, so
Oh,
it's just running from here. So you can change.
Then you should use this. That's fine. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I hope some of us are still not too tired for this penultimate presentation. It's an immense honor to be here and speak at the Theosophical History Conference. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, ITC Norton, for having us. I will talk about a section of my chapter from my PhD dissertation, which is on Buddhism and Theosophy's interconnected networks in South Asia, in Bengal, and how that is important in the global history of the Theosophical movement and related discourses. Buddhism's history in Bengal dates back to the 3rd century BCE. It flourished in the region until the 12th century CE, after which it declined in the face of growing Brahmanism and the consequent Turkish conquest. Later, Bengal witnessed a growing interest in the religion under the British Raj. There is a bigger picture of the reception of Buddhism in pre-colonial and colonial Bengal. In this presentation, I won't have time to discuss the details of my research from the PhD dissertation. Instead, I will focus on a few individuals, both Indian and European, who were strongly associated with the Theosophical movement and the Buddhist network. In this context, I will also investigate how a South Asian city, namely Darjeeling, became connected to the global Theosophical discourse. So at first, I wish to say a few words about Darjeeling's geopolitical significance and its importance in the history of the TS. The British Indian government acquired the hill station from the Kingdom of Sikkim in 1835. It had strategic importance for the British government. As a hill station located in the eastern Himalayas, it was closer to the kingdoms of Sikkim, Nepal, and Bhutan. After acquiring control over Sikkim in 1861, Darjeeling became a significant outpost for the British Raj in the shortest trade route between Lhasa, which was Tibetan capital, and Calcutta, which was then the Indian capital. And that route went through Sikkim. However, Sikkim was a protectorate state of the British Raj and hence not directly administered by the Indian government. There was a parallel trade route to Tibet via the Kingdom of Nepal. Darjeeling was also a preferred point of passage through that route due to its proximity to Nepal. Therefore, Darjeeling was the last checkpoint within the British Indian territories in those trade routes that connected Calcutta and Lhasa. Moreover, Darjeeling was the summer capital of the Bengal Presidency, which is one of the administered zones of the British India. On several occasions, the hill station acted as a meeting place between the diplomatic dialogue between the representatives of the British Indian government, the Chinese emperor, and those of the kingdoms of Tibet, Nepal, and Sikkim. Darjeeling and Calcutta, located roughly 600 kilometers from each other, were connected via rail route. Therefore, Darjeeling had a great geopolitical importance for the British government and all the people interested in Tibet. The latter included the scholarly Orientalists, the amateur explorers, and the occultists. Boris Dizirkov, Blavatsky's biographer, mentions that during the mid-19th century, while making a failed attempt to enter Tibet via Nepal by crossing the river Rangit, she allegedly scouted the vicinities of the Darjeeling district. Darjeeling made its first appearance in Theosophical history through these accounts. However, it is difficult to verify this piece of information supplied by Dizirkov, as no other scholars apart from him makes a mention of this. However, she certainly visited Darjeeling and the surrounding areas of the autumn of 1882, soon after the foundation of the Bengal Theosophical Society Lodge in Calcutta. During this trip, she took a train from Calcutta to North Bengal, thus reaching Darjeeling. Her goal was to reach at the Buddhist monasteries in Sikkim, traveling by foot from Darjeeling. She was accompanied by a dozen native Theosophists from Calcutta and 4 or 5 Buddhists from Ceylon and Burma. From the end of September until the middle of November, Blavatsky and her entourage scouted across Darjeeling and its surrounding areas, mainly locating monasteries and meeting Buddhist lamas. Incidentally, Mohini Chatterjee, whom I have researched in my PhD dissertation, accompanied Blavatsky during this trip. Mohini believed that he met the followers of Master Kuthumi during this trip. Based on his thoughts, he penned an article titled, "The Himalayan Brothers, Do They Exist?" In this article, he explained his encounters with the disciples of Master Kuthumi. Mohini's article drew some attention in the Theosophical circle in the 1880s, 1890s, and invited discussions on this topic. Afterwards, Damodar Mavalankar, before disappearing in the Tibetan Himalayas, also passed through Darjeeling in 1885. Colonel Olcott kept on returning to Darjeeling whenever an opportunity arose. For instance, he visited the hill station in 1883, 87, and 1892. In March 1883, he set up a branch called the Kanchenjunga Lodge. However, it did not remain operational for long. The Theosophical Society eventually established another branch in Darjeeling in 1924 called the Himachal Lodge. Both Kanchenjunga Lodge and Himachal Lodge recruited several Bengalis based in the town. One such fellow was Srinath Chatterjee, who was elected as the secretary of the Kanchenjunga Lodge. The Theosophical Society Lodge and his house became the centers for the meetings held between the Theosophists and Tibetan Buddhist lamas. Chatterjee was probably versed in the Tibetan language. On one occasion, we find him functioning as an interpreter between Olcott and the Tibetan Lama Gwen Shapa. Neither Olcott nor other official records of the Theosophical Society specified the subjects of the discussions of these meetings. One might assume that these places developed as vital centers for exchanging ideas between occultism and Tibetan traditions. Therefore, Darjeeling stands out as a crucial location in South Asian Theosophy. In this context, it is important to say a few words about Sharat Chandra Das, the most significant Indian interlocutor for the Theosophists in Tibetan affairs. K. Paul Johnson has examined his contacts with the Theosophical movement, identifying him as an inspiration for the Theosophical masters. I argue that he was one of the first Tibetologists of South Asia. Born in Bangladesh and studying in Calcutta, Das found a job as the headmaster of the Bhutia boarding school in Darjeeling in 1874. From here on, Das's earliest connection with Tibet started developing. He visited Tibet multiple times and collected Tibetan and Sanskrit manuscripts between 1879 and 1884. In his pursuits, he was assisted by a Tibetan Lama based in Darjeeling called Uen Gatso. Das wrote two memoirs titled Journey to Lhasa and Central Tibet and Indian Pundits in the Land of Snow, thus documenting his expeditions. Following his travels, he settled in Darjeeling, bought a house on the hill station and named it Lhasa Villa, which there he engaged in the publication of Tibetan texts and worked as a Tibetan translator for the government of Bengal. Das gradually gained a reputation in the elite circles of Calcutta as a specialist in Tibetan affairs and became an honorary member of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. His scholarly articles appeared in the prestigious periodicals of the city, and he was well known to the elite circles, as I said. He returned to Calcutta from Darjeeling in 1914, owing to his declining health. The British government sent him on an official mission to Japan, where he passed away in January 1917. The Theosophists came in contact with him in the 1880s. During the 1880s and 1890s, Olcott developed friendly relations with him and often consulted him on Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan and Mongolian scripts. Olcott's reverence for Das is reflected in multiple mentions of the latter in his diary. For example, after meeting Das in June 1885, Olcott wrote, "Sharad Babu is the most interesting man to talk with if one cares about Tibet and Northern Buddhism, for he knows more about them than any man in India or outside it for that matter." K. Paul Johnson suggests that the Tibetan texts Das received from the Tashil Hunpo monastery had passed on to Blavatsky via Olcott for her writings. Johnson notes that Blavatsky's writings, which were later classified as quote-unquote Tibetan teachings in the collected writings of Blavatsky, edited by Boris de Zirkov, had inputs from Das and his associates in Tibet. Thus, Ashok's contacts with the Theosophical Society continued even after Blavatsky's death. For instance, in January 1893, Olcott was invited as a guest speaker at the first annual meeting of the Buddhist Text Society of India, the organization that started by Das in 1892. Das remained a prominent figure in the Theosophical circle of Bengal throughout his lifetime. The Theosophist often advertised the Buddhist Text Society of India, which he founded. His organization was modeled upon Pali Text Society of London, which was established in 1881, probably by Chris Davids. The Theosophical Society's contact with Sharatchandra Das is a prominent example of how Tibetan thoughts entered the world of occultism through Bengali actors. His case indicates the networks through which the ideas traveled from Tibet to the West. Das's works became one of the earliest channels used for Theosophy's appropriation of Tibetan traditions. It continued with others in the following 2 decades in 2 different ways. Firstly, through Indian scholars such as Harish Prasad Shastri, or the adventures of some Europeans, both which I will mention in the following paragraphs. The Bengali intellectuals' fascination for Buddhism achieved a new vigor when, in the beginning of 20th century, during this time, Harish Shastri, a leading scholar of Sanskrit and Bengali literature, rediscovered and published the Charyapadas, the Charjapad as it is pronounced in Bengali, which passed into oblivion for 1,000 years. Shastri, a former principal of the Sanskrit College and the librarian of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, while working at the Royal Library of Nepal, he visited the Himalayan kingdom in 1907. He found, incidentally, this manuscript at the Royal Library and published this with his commentary and titled it Hajar Bachore Purano Bangla Bhashay Bauddha Gano Doha. I translate it as Buddhist songs and couplets in the 1,000-year-old Bengali language. And this was published in 1916. The work opened a new chapter in the history of Bengali language and interested the linguists concerned with the evolution of modern Bengali language. One must note that the Theosophical Society and the Mahabodhi Society, which was founded by Anagarika Dharmapala, have been interested in Shastri's works on Buddhist history since the turn of the 20th century, much before he became an academic celebrity after the discovery of the Charyapadas. For example, we find Olcott consulting him regarding Buddhist history in Calcutta in 1892. In 1902, when the Mahabodhi Society instituted a committee for translating, publishing, and cultivating Buddhist texts and the Pali languages, Shastri was appointed as its vice president, while Narendranath Sen, who was then the president of the Bengal Theosophical Society Lodge, was also appointed as president of this committee. Records suggest that Shastri also donated a few books and manuscripts to the Adya Library, including his work titled History of Living Buddhism. The collaboration between Hariprasad Shastri and the Theosophical movement reflects that the latter was eager to understand Buddhism from an academic perspective. The scholarly consultation also indicates that the Theosophical Society occasionally projected itself as a supporter of the empirical research on the Indian religions. As a side note, I want to mention that Shastri's son, Binatosh Bhattacharya, was an accomplished scholar of Tantric Buddhism. He was employed in the Baroda State Service. He taught at the Sanskrit College of Baroda and served as the director of Oriental Institute of Baroda from 1927 to 1952. His publications include a book titled Introduction to Buddhist Esotericism, published in 1932, which you can see on your screen. The book traced the origin of Buddhist Tantra in what he termed as primitive magic, investigated the rise of Vajrayana, Buddhist Tantric sect, and the impact of Buddhist Tantrism on Hinduism. It is interesting that an Indian scholar was using the label esotericism to study Buddhism from an academic perspective as early as 1930s, which provokes the question of whether his works could be considered an Indian prototype to the scholarly study of esotericism. His other works and academic career indicate that he had an interest in the scholarly study of esoteric subjects. However, a detailed survey of his life and works is outside the scope of the present work and also this presentation. Before I end, I want to mention a Dutch theosophist called Johan van Manen. Van Manen is considered one of the first among Dutch Tibetologists and Orientalists. Born in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, Van Manen first came in contact with Theosophy in 1896 and established a lodge in Haarlem in 1897, which is not far from here. Van Manen is perhaps the only Indo-Dutch connection in the entangled history of occultism and in Bengal. Van Manen's curiosity for Tibet and Buddhism brought him to Adyar in 1909, where he lived until 1916. In 1916, after leaving Adyar, he went to Darjeeling and started learning the Tibetan language. The 4 years he spent in Darjeeling from 1916 to 1920, it made him an expert in Tibetan language and Mahayana Buddhism. He lived in Jorbanglo, a small village near Ghum railway station in the Darjeeling district. Here he started learning about the Tibetan language and Buddhist culture. Peter Richardus, Van Manen's biographer, notes that he received assistance from Karma Sumdhongpal, a teacher and later director of Darjeeling High School, and Phuntsok Lamtok, a scribe from central Tibet. Johan van Manen maintained a retinue of Tibetan collaborators and informants during his stay in Darjeeling, and many of them continued to keep in touch with him after he left for Calcutta. Peter Richardus writes that Phuntsok Lamtok accompanied Van Manen in his visit to Adyar in 1980 and became the first Tibetan to be welcomed at the Theosophical Society's headquarters. Phuntsok Lamtok would eventually become an important interlocutor for Johan van Manen and the British government and play a vital role in the knowledge exchange between India and Tibet. Although Van Manen himself never visited Tibet, he became a foremost European expert on the region and its culture. Johan van Manen returned to Calcutta in 1920 and joined the Asiatic Society of Bengal, first as a librarian and then as a secretary. He had an excellent reputation as a secretary of this prestigious institution of Orientalist scholarship and was a favorite in Calcutta's social and intellectual circles. He still stands as the longest serving secretary of the Asiatic Society. While in Calcutta, Van Manen maintained contact with his interlocutors in Darjeeling, who shared information about the Tibetan language and culture. Several of his letters, which I came across during my research at the Asiatic Society, he exchanged these letters with Father Hoston, a school teacher in Darjeeling and an expert in Tibetan affairs. These letters are still, as I mentioned, survive in the archives of the Asiatic Society. It is difficult to know if Van Manen made any contact with the BTS, Bengal Theosophical Society Lodge, or its members. However, Mircea Eliade, the leading well-known scholar of religion who studied in Calcutta, was in close contact with him. However, Eliade was also very much linked with the Theosophical circles, whom I investigate in my dissertation. Eliade wrote, I quote him, Van Manen knew India, especially Bengal, like few Europeans did, unquote. Eliade also claimed to have started learning the Tibetan language from Johan van Manen. To conclude, I wish to say the following, that the Theosophical societies and Buddhist interconnected networks, it is important to recognize the geopolitical importance of South Asian cities such as Darjeeling and what they are contributing to the global theosophical discourse and how bringing, the connection between not only South Asia and the Western world, but also connecting Tibet and creating an imagination for Tibet through its network. Secondly, it is important to acknowledge the Bengali agency and, in a broad sense, the South Asian agency in the theosophical discourses and what they are bringing into the global theosophical movement, as well as the modern history of esotericism, which is one of the main point of discussion of my PhD dissertation. And thirdly, theosophical interjections in the early foundation of Tibetology is very important to note. I argue that the Theosophical movement innovated Tibetan studies through its Orientalist imagination of Tibet. And this is what I would like to draw what, for example, Paulina Grossman's presentations yesterday, or even Bjarke's presentation yesterday, that discipline making or the development of academic field is very much connected to theosophical innovative history. And Theosophical Society has contributed to a great extent, consciously or unconsciously, in this academic field making. And it is important to investigate these discipline making more in the historical investigation of the Theosophical movement. Thank you very much.